This is the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast with Gary Taylor.
Hello and welcome to another Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Thank you for joining us again. If you listened to the previous episode, you know that Steve Waddingham, the AML historian and AMHT trustee, grabbed the microphone to host that episode. Having done such a good job, we let him loose again with the mic and sent him overseas. Well, I say overseas, I mean the Isle of Wight. So this time he visits a good friend and past AML colleague Chris de Vallancey and tells us about his ownership of his treasured DB5, having purchased it for just a few £100 back in 1974. Plus, he recalls his stints with Aston Martin Lagonda over the years. Anyway, enough of an introduction for me, so I now pass you over to our roving reporter, or is it our overseas correspondent? Not sure. I'll let Steve decide, and here he is.
Roving reporter, Steve Waddingham here. Gary, back in the studio. Those people that know me well will probably smile at this point because I'm actually technically on holiday on the Isle of Wight. So why am I picking up the recorder and interrupting my holiday, I hear you ask? I couldn't come all the way to the Isle of Wight without looking up my dear old friend, Chris de Vallancey. I'll introduce you properly in a moment, but Chris and I have known each other for many, many years and worked together as well. In fact, I work for Chris, and it's Chris's fault that I'm back at Aston Martin in the first place. A lot of people won't know this, but I actually left Aston in 2007 and came back in 2010. And it was a fateful pub lunch, which was basically the interview for the job, of coming back to work for Chris as part of a two-man department, which was the Heritage Parks Department. So that's how I ended up back at Aston. That was back in 2010. But we go back a lot longer than that, don't we, Chris? So I'll hand the mic over to you in a moment. But I think I worked it out the other day that I first met Chris in 1991 at the Earls Court Motor Fair. Yeah. And the Motor Fair being, if you remember, the motor show was always used to be in Birmingham and Motor Fair was in Earls Court. And in 91... AML was on its knees basically and couldn't afford to have a major stand, so we at the last minute were invited to perch literally on the end of the RS Williams stand, and we had like a garden gazebo, and we were selling merchandise, t-shirts, baseball caps, etc., and I was one of the crew of people that was on the stand doing that. And that's when I first met Chris. And in a moment, I'll let Chris explain how that all came about. But here we go. Without any further ado, Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you indeed. Lovely introduction, Steve.
Chris, you're quite a unique individual, really. I've known you a long time, and I can't think of anybody else I've ever met that's pretty much had a career around a car. So you're the owner of a DB5. I'll let you explain more about that in a moment. But suffice to say, your career has kind of followed the car, hasn't it, really, in a way? Tell us your story, Chris.
Okay, well, it all really started, and I don't want to give anybody a boring CV, but when I was 8 years old, my uncle had a DB24. He went out to work in South Africa, I believe at the time, for 2 years, and left the DB24 for my father to look after. And I was already a petrol head at that age. But my first memory of anything to do with Astons was being allowed to start up the DB24 and warm the engine up. And the rest, in many ways, is history, because I took that decision there and then that all I ever wanted was an Aston and to be involved with Aston Martin.
So your car, your DB5, how did that come about? How did you suddenly find yourself in a position to buy a DB5? And what were you doing at the time when that came about? Right.
Well, I started saving up, believe it or not, doing holiday jobs from school from sort of the age of 14 onwards, and it was working in shops in Guildford where we lived at the time, serving petrol on forecourts on Sundays, anything I could sort of lay my hands on. We got to a point where I was 19 in 1974. I just happened to be looking through a copy of Motorsport, and there was a DB5 for sale for £750. I thought, well, I sort of showed it to my father because the going price for a reasonable DB5 at the time was £1,500. At the time, I'd bailed out of university and I was working on I was on the management training scheme with Marks and Spencer, which was a very short part of my early career. It got curtailed very, very quickly. But anyway, I had a chat with my father about it, and bless him, he was a total petrol head and enthusiast. And long story short, he went up to Suffolk, to Ipswich, and came back with £750 worth of the scruffiest DB5 you could ever lay your eyes on. And it had just scraped an MOT, but officially it was an MOT failure. So I'd taken out a bank loan of £500. I'd saved up £250, and the deal was done. So, yeah, at the tender age of 19, I was broke but an Aston owner.
And that is absolutely brilliant. 19 years old, £750 later, you're a DB5 owner. Was the car the colour it is now, silver birch?
Yeah. It was a standard DB5, and as we've said, originally silver birch, not one of the ones that's been dressed up to look like a Bond car. It was in a horrible state, and at the time I wasn't particularly interested in doing anything but drive it. So my father, who had immense skills for a bank manager in particular, at rebuilding old cars, he did an awful lot of the work to get the car up to some sort of sensible state. It had been through 5 owners prior to myself and was totally abused. Lots of battle scars, corrosion in the usual areas. He had his work cut out, but after a solid sort of 2 years of work, the car was properly usable. Then, like a complete idiot, and I was 21 at the time, remember it well, I decided to drive it into a lamppost. Cross-ply tyres weren't that grippy, absolutely no excuses, youthful exuberance and a total lack of skill. So the interesting thing at the time was that I had third-party fire and theft insurance. So it was really back to saving up the pennies and buying parts, and we were into yet another slightly more substantial rebuild. And I think in some respects that probably triggered the start of my Aston career, because I'd been a parts customer of Hyde Vale Garage, who were our closest service dealer at the time. So I got to know Ray Taft and Richard Zethrin quite well, and I was always pushing them for a discount on parts. The accident did one good thing, in that it actually gave me the motivation to pick up spanners. And whilst I would never say that I've had a professional talent, I probably had enough inbuilt expertise in the genes, if you like, to become a talented amateur. That's the stage we got to, and that was the start of my relationship with Hyde Vale.
So yeah, Hyde Vale, and then I met you when you were doing some work with Richard Williams, yes. RS Williams.
Yeah.
And then I've sort of followed you until we both merged together at AML.
We did.
Aston Service Dorset in the, what would that have been, the 90s, wouldn't it? Sort of back end of the 90s.
Yeah. So sadly, Hyde Vale went under not for commercial reasons, but for family reasons to do with the ownership of the business. Very sadly, 26 people were made redundant quite quickly. I'd been parts manager there since the early 80s. But April 1989, the doors closed at Hyde Vale, and I was then in a little bit of limbo land for a while because I still wanted to work with Aston Martin. It had got into my veins and my bones and all the rest of it by then. I was asked by Richard Williams just to help out on the stand at the Earl's Court Motor Fair in that year, and that's when I met you, Steve. But running parallel with that, Lancaster Sevenoaks had taken up the Aston franchise for South East London and Kent. They asked me to become their in-house Aston specialist and help set it up, both on sales and after sales and parts. That was a sort of interim, if you like. And then not too long after that, I was then asked to go and help set up Auto Performance in Paris, which then became Aston Martin Paris. Had a very happy 2 years flitting out to France for a fortnight at a time, sometimes 3 weeks, and again helping set up the operation for Alain Aziza, who was the then owner and a very dear friend and sadly departed. So I was still sort of in the mix, and I think also I was knocking at the door of Newport Pagnell saying, have you got any openings for me? I think times being what they were, and cash-strapped times, which is not unusual in the annals of Aston Martin. It all came full circle when Richard Williams asked me to become his parts manager, and I absolutely jumped at the opportunity.
So our careers kind of weave in and out, don't we, really? Because that's probably when I would have met you again, when you were working with Richard. And then later on when you went to the Aston Service Dorset. And then our paths properly crossed again, like I said earlier, in 2010, when you kind of lured me back into AML. One thing there's lots of confessions going to come out today. One of which is that I remember, going to meet you in a pub not far from Newport Pagnell. I'd finally gone back into kind of full-time employment, having worked for myself for a while. And I was working at a lovely little garage in Northampton, just an ordinary independent garage, nothing to do with Aston. Had a good job, but I knew deep down, if I could, I needed to go back to AML, but no idea how that was going to happen. And then things fell into place, and you and I had a conversation. We met in the pub, but I remember thinking, well, if nothing else, I'm going to get a 3-course lunch out of AML. So I remember you saying, do you want a starter? And I remember me saying, yes, definitely. Because I thought, if nothing else, I'll get a lunch out of this. Because I couldn't, even at that point, I couldn't quite imagine how I was going to get back in because there were one or two obstacles in the way. But you thankfully helped me get back over and into that department. And we had a good time, didn't we?
We did. Absolutely. Well, I'd been offered a position as general manager down at Aston Service Dorset, and it was with slight reluctance because I was very, very happy at Richard Williams. Obviously, the business at that stage had become really the leading specialist, or very much one of the leading specialists in the world for restoration, and I'd built up the parts business. But the opportunity arose to be general manager in Dorset, and as a lover of the West Country, I took up the offer, left Richards, but then 18 months had gone past, and I had a visit from the general manager of the parts operation at Aston's, which then was still based at Newport Pagnell. The outcome of that, and again, Steve, it was a pub lunch involved, but I was tentatively asked if Aston Martin started up a proper heritage operation, fully focused on looking after the older cars, would I be interested in heading it up? And to be offered a position at the factory and to actually have a big task to take on and to have the opportunity to make a big difference in keeping the older cars healthy and on the road and used, I couldn't pass that opportunity up. So March 2000, I started as manager of the heritage operation, and that really closes the loop of the CV.
Quite a big moment really in our history, because at that point things got really serious in terms of how we support heritage cars, and that still runs today, as you know. And if the listeners will be aware, a couple of episodes ago we were at Wolverton Mill, which is where the business moved to as it outgrew Newport Pagnell to house all the parts, and it's still thriving today. And we met obviously the modern team that are there, and I know that you and we keep in touch, and I know you do with other people as well. And we were just talking off air about this. Once you're in the Aston family, you're in it for life, aren't you, really? Neither of us can ever leave. No. and that's why we sat here whilst I'm on holiday having this conversation. But it's magic, isn't it? I would do it all again. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat.
And we didn't do it for the money. We've never done it for the money.
No, I think anyone listening that knows us well will probably be nodding at that point. But we don't do it for the money. But we do it because we love the cars, and we love the people that the cars attract. And that's the people that own them, the people that work at the factory, the people who work in the dealers and in the garages and the independents. Where you know, it's a real family, isn't it? And there's different levels of people being in the family. Another little confession I think we should get out into the open is, if anyone out there has read the Ben Collins book on Aston Martin, if you turn to page 229, there's a funny little story about, we're described as being two old buccaneers from Newport Pagnell, and it's a great story, and it's absolutely true, about you and I sat in a meeting room, and somebody from marketing came to see us and was giving us an update on what was going on at the factory. And we're basically telling us about a new car that was coming out called the Virage. At which point you just sipped your tea, and it kind of launched itself across the boardroom table, because we both looked at each other. With the name Virage had not at that point quite recovered from the original Virage, which now, with all the fullness of time, has become a great classic car in its own right. But I think it's fair to say it had a few problems when it was new. But anyway, if you read that part of that book, that we are both in there as described as being old buccaneers, I seem to remember. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing, really. And here we are, Chris. Let's talk about where we're sat right now. We're sat, and it's hard to call it a garage because it's a bit better than just an ordinary garage. But I feel like I'm sat in a little corner somewhere in the Aston Martin world, because there's very familiar things dotted around on the walls and on the workbench, etc. But also there's a very familiar looking thing in the shape of a silver birch DB5. And so you're now coming to the end of what's been quite a lengthy restoration again.
7 years. It's been a 7-year project. I thought before I retire, I owe it to the car, although it was obviously by now mechanically sound and usable. She was still a bit scruffy. Some of the panels didn't fit properly. Some of the bonnet gaps were off. And I thought I owed it to the car, after all these years of ownership, to really do a proper job so that the car was exactly how I wanted it. Not over-restored, but sympathetically restored, with a view to keeping everything as original as possible. I've done a substantial amount of the work myself, but obviously some of the skilled work on the panel work and the paint, and I have had an enormous amount of help to get the car into the condition that it is now, which I'm hoping that I will be able to put it into a concours soon. We'll see how we fare, but I'll be doing that for fun. But at least I know now Richard Williams have done the most fantastic job on the engine for me. We've ended up with a car that I'm massively proud of.
It is a lovely car, as all DB5s are lovely, let's face it. I mean, I know there are different DB5s in terms of condition and where they've been restored, but they're all generally a lovely looking car to start with. But your car, to me, because I know you really well, and I know how many hours and hours we've spent looking at things, studying things, and you've always, you've always been a kind of an oracle of information on particularly DB5, because you've lived with one for so long. And that car, to me, it's almost a reference point of how a DB5 should be in terms of having all the little original features, and it being a car that has survived fairly originally anyway over a long period of time. And there are, it's 50 years. When you work it out, if you're saying you bought it in 74,
yes,
it's 50 years this year that you've owned that car, which itself, there aren't many 50-year-old ownership DB5s. The DB5s nowadays tend to be on their, fairly lengthy ownership number. 14, 15 owners is not unheard of. But to have a car that's had one owner for 50 years is fairly rare. But for that person to then also be who you are, and you are a piece of AML legend as far as I'm concerned, to have you as the owner for 50 years, I think it makes that car even more special than it would be anyway for being a Silver Birch DB5 from new. There are certain things that are drummed into me, and other people in our industry as well, which will know things like, if someone says DB5 Vallancey, you recoil in horror because you know that's wrong, and it's DB5 convertible, not Vallancey. But what I've learnt from you, and I would never ever forget this, are things like the fact that DB5s left the factory without any mirrors. So we're all been brought up on a diet of silver DB5s with wing mirrors, but that's only on the James Bond car. And although they were an option, the cars normally left without any mirrors at all. And they certainly didn't have door mirrors, which a lot of cars have got now. And I know that for you, it's an absolute pet hate when you see a DB5 with a door mirror. And I've ended up inheriting it as well. And I'm now spending a lot of my time looking at models and images of DB5 that are going into things that we're licensing. And the first thing I do is get the mirrors taken off, unless, of course, it's meant to be a James Bond DB5, which is fair enough, having the mirrors. But the devil's in the detail, isn't it?
Well, it is. And having been in the very, very lucky position, being heritage manager of the parts department, is having access to the archives and the old handwritten original buying cards, because one of the first things I did, and it was part and parcel of my sort of concours judging with the club, was to establish, did the car or could the car ever have left the factory with this bit bolted on? And door mirrors had always sort of rung a bit of an alarm bell with me. Wing mirrors, as you rightly say, Steve, on the Bond car, and indeed they were an official option, and they're in the parts book. But those are the bullet-shaped mirrors that fit on the wings. But the cars never, ever left the factory with mirrors on the doors. And I understand the practical reasons why people need them. But if as time goes on, as the decades pass, you find cars have got this bit bolted on, that bit bolted on. And if what we're trying to do is focus on originality, and I'll never forget one of my old English teachers, and it was way before the PC times, but he always used to drill into me, and I'll never forget, one of his sayings was, if man cannot create and cannot preserve, he is nothing but a barbarian. And I've always looked on the older Astons as something that should be cherished. These cars were on the production line for 3 months. They were crafted with a lot of skill, with artisan panel beaters, with people, some of whom were third generation workers, either from, the Tickford days before David Brown took over the business. And you think, well, actually, something so beautiful, let's keep it the way it was when it drove out of here in 1964 or whenever. So, yeah, I do get on my soapbox sometimes, but...
Yeah, I mean, just for anyone's benefit listening, people are familiar with Newport Pagnell being the home of DB5, and it still is today. But when you're talking about third generation workers, so that if you think back, you're building cars mid 1960s, and some of those people building those cars were third generation in terms of working at what was originally Tickford before it became Aston Martin. So if you go back, there would have been people working on those cars that their grandfathers would have been building cars in the 1910s, 1920s, and then through the wartime period, etc. So it's amazing, really, that those cars have got that link that goes all that way back, not just for Aston Martin, but for the town of Newport Pagnell, in terms of the skills that are just inbred into people in that town. One of my other favourite little details that, again, I would never have picked up on, but because of working with you, and I remember us introducing the part again, is the little rubber bush that sits on top of the gear lever. Now, I want you to explain this, and anybody listening, if you've got a DB, and I think I'm right in saying this applies to DB 5 and 6. Yeah. Right, so Chris, tell the listener what it is I'm hinting at.
Well, this is another stupid little detail, but there's a part number 476093, and I'll always remember the number, and it is actually just a little rubber bush, a little sleeve, and its primary purpose is on the radiator stays, but it also is situated on the gear lever. I've never fully worked out quite why it should be there, apart from possibly stopping a few oil fumes come up through the gear lever gaiter. But it should always sit on top of the gear lever gaiter. It should never be buried into the collar of the leather on the gaiter. It should always sit on top. And it wasn't... I never actually... It was always my personal belief, and I'd always pointed it out at concours events when I was judging, and there were always a few disputes and differences of opinion out of something that was essentially a really niggly little bit. But it wasn't until I actually managed to get hold of, thanks to the Heritage Trust, to get a copy of the original DB5 sales brochure. And if you have a look in there, and it's got a red Connolly interior, and lo and behold, there is the little 476093 bush sitting on top of the gear lever gaiter.
The devil's in the detail, isn't it? So you've got a DB5 or a DB6 Mark 1. Next time you get in the car, just double check, have you got that little rubber bush on top of your gear lever gaiter? And if not, ring up your local parts stockist and order the said item, and unscrew your gear knob, drop it on, pop the knob back on, and there you go. You'll be all up to sort of concourse detail level. Should Chris ever walk past your DB5? But no, it really is great, reminiscing with you, Chris, and sitting there talking about stuff. And congratulations, really, on finally getting your DB5, not just back on the road, but getting it here to the Isle of Wight, because you drove the car back from Surrey, where it had been, over on the ferry and onto the Isle of Wight, and here it is.
It was quite an emotional event, because I got the car back to my retirement. I won't call it a retirement home. It's the home where I have chosen to retire with my wife. But got the car home literally 2 days before the 50th anniversary of the day I bought the car. Wow. So, yes, we cracked open a very decent bottle of champagne for that. Something else that, just in summing up, is what has been so wonderful over a fairly long and checkered career has been the relationships and the friends that stay with you. And some of those relationships start out as business relationships and they turn into lifelong friendships. And I think that's one point that I would like to make, just sort of looking back over the years. And I do still miss many people, and I'm hoping to catch up with them now that I've got a little bit more time on my hands. Not just to reminisce, but also just to see how they're doing, how their cars are doing, and without bigging myself up, just because it was always a team effort, and it always has been a team effort. But I'm just really pleased that we were able to get things like DB6 bumpers and V8 bumpers reintroduced, and radiator grills, and it's not just covering the DBs; it's going right through to all the V8s and indeed DB7. That we fought some business battles at times that were quite challenging, but to actually get some of these bits back on the shelf so that the cars can be driven and enjoyed with confidence, because you know you can get that bit or you can get that bit, and with the support of, as we've said before, the family that is out there, and the great work still being done by colleagues, or I should say ex-colleagues now. The factory means that hopefully these cars will be around for many, many years to come.
So many people in our world that are committed to doing this, and I think it means that we've got a good safety net for our older cars, and the cars that aren't old yet but will be old one day. There's not only an old car smell, there's actually a smell of a DB5, I think, because there's a certain smell in this building right now, and it could only be one type of car. But anyway, we can't bring that to life through the podcast, but what we can do some sound recording of what the car or what a DB5 should sound like. So here we go. Right, hit the switch, Chris. There we go. That is what a DB5 should sound like. Chris, I think you want the final word on your car. And you said something to me earlier which made me smile. So I'll hand over the microphone again. Just end on a high point.
The women have come and gone, but the Aston has stayed.
There we go. I'm not quite sure how PC that is nowadays, but thank you ever so much for sparing the time this morning to have a chat and to show me the car. And I've watched the car go from, as it was unrestored, through the restoration, and now not just seeing it restored, but seeing it back with you here on the Isle of Wight. It really is amazing. And I'd just like to sort of thank you for all you've done for everybody over the years, and to wish you a very long, happy retirement. And I will definitely be back. I've fallen in love with the Isle of Wight while I've been here. A long time overdue for visiting, and we'll always be friends, and I'll definitely be back for a cup of tea at some point. Thanks, Chris. Thanks ever so much.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. I think just in summing up, as I say, this is it's always been a team thing, and I'm very grateful to you, Steve, for as you're still working for Aston Martin and doing such a grand job. And I know it's the heritage of the business is in really, really good hands. Can't think of anybody better.
You're listening to the Aston Martin Heritage Podcast. Discover more about the story of Aston Martin, the cars, the people, the history, with the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. You're always welcome to visit us at our museum in Oxfordshire, so find out more via amht.org.uk.